In this module, we'll continue building on the plunk that we've been working on for the last couple modules, the GitHub viewer. And to demonstrate one of the timer services from Angular, I'd like to play a bit of a game with the user. When the application loads, I will only give the user 5 seconds to perform a user search. Otherwise, the application will search for them using whatever is in that search text box. So we will count down from 5 to 0, and when we reach 0, automatic search. I probably want to let the user know what that countdown value is. So we can display 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 on the screen. And that means over inside of the controller, I will probably want to initialize a variable called countdown, and I'll set it initially equal to 5. Now, before we even get timers involved, I want to think about the logic of how do I count down and perform an automatic search. So let me create a function called decrement countdown. That will be a function that ultimately I want it called once every second, and we'll figure out how to do that in just a bit. But right now, I'm going to say that whenever this is called, we will subtract 1 from countdown, and then if countdown is equal to 0, or I could also say less than 1, we will do an automatic search. So scope.search, and because search requires a username, I will just pass in scope.username, because that is the model value that is bound to that input search. Now the question is, how do I get this function invoked once a second? Well, JavaScript provides some native global functions that you can use to work with timers. There is setTimeout and there is setInterval. SetTimeout works by passing in a piece of code and then the number of milliseconds into the future when you want that code invoked. So if I want to have a method called doWork invoked in 2 seconds, I would call setTimeout, doWork, and pass in 2000 milliseconds. SetInterval is very similar, except SetInterval will continue to invoke that method every time its countdown expires. It counts down from 2000 milliseconds to 0, and every time it hits 0, it invokes that method and then resets the timer to 2000 milliseconds. It will continue to do that until you cancel that interval. Now, I could use these functions directly in my Angular application, but I don't want to. It turns out that Angular provides a service, or actually 2 services, that wrap these 2 functions. So there is a $timeout service that wraps setTimeout, and there's a $interval service that wraps setInterval. I want the $interval because I want to call decrement countdown once a second. And there's a couple really good reasons to use these services instead of the built-in functions that JavaScript provides. Both reasons are a little beyond the scope of what this course is, but let me briefly describe them. One reason is unit testing. If you want to unit test the code inside of this controller, it's much easier to unit test if you're using Angular services instead of built-in intrinsic JavaScript objects like setTimeout. Angular provides you a way to substitute a testable counterpart to a service like interval. So during a unit test, it's not really using a timer. And if you build bigger Angular applications, I strongly suggest you take a look at unit testing. I know it has saved me a lot of time on the Angular projects I've been in. The second reason to use these services has to do with some internal details of how Angular performs two-way data binding. If I change the model inside of a function called from setTimeout or setInterval, I might see that my page does not update correctly. I don't have data moving from my model onto the screen. But that problem goes away if I use the built-in Angular services. And for that reason, instead of using setInterval, I want to ask Angular to provide my controller with a $interval service. And the way I would use that service is, let's say down here at the bottom of the controller, once everything is set up and initialized, I will explicitly call a function called startCountdown. And startCountdown will just be another implementation detail here. So startCountdown is a function that when it gets invoked, it's going to go to interval, and it's going to tell interval to call decrement countdown every 1000 milliseconds or 1 second. And then there's actually a third parameter that interval provides. Usually setInterval will just run forever until the user leaves the page or you cancel it. The interval service, you can actually specify a parameter here for the number of intervals that you want. So I want 5 intervals and then stop using that timer after that. Or I could say scope.countdown, which is also equal to a 5, but now I don't have it hard-coded. I just want to use this interval for 5 ticks. And after the 5th tick, stop calling that decrement countdown function. Now, one thing that you might notice is a little bit odd about this interval service is that it's a function. I can invoke it. And indeed, in Angular, you can have different types of services. So interval is a function. I can immediately invoke it. HTTP has more of an object API, so I typically invoke methods that are on that service, like http.get. And you'll see examples of both of these throughout Angular. Services that you have to dot into some method to get it to perform work, and then services where you just invoke the service and pass in some parameters and something magical happens. So now I think I have all the code set up, but let's come over to the preview window and I will see that something has gone terribly wrong. My application's not running, but that's okay. I want to show you about how to troubleshoot a specific scenario with Angular. Let's open up the developer tools and I'll see undefined is not a function. That usually means I have something that is undefined. I tried to invoke it like a function. This is the type error that I will get in Chrome. I can see this happen in start countdown, and that is in script.js, line 31. So let's go to script.js, line 31, and I will see that this must be the interval service. This is the one method that I'm invoking here. Why is interval? Why am I not getting that service from Angular? So a couple things to check when this happens. First thing to check is, are you naming that service correctly as a function argument? And if I go and check the Angular API documentation, I will see, yes, there is a service, $interval. I have it spelled correctly. It's using the proper case, but for some reason, I'm getting an undefined value for that. And really, undefined means Angular didn't know what to give you. So if you have that service spelled correctly as a function argument, the next place to check would be wherever you are registering that controller, which is done with module.controller. In this case, we called it app.controller. That's the registration for this controller. I'm telling Angular, here's something called main controller, and here's an array that describes that controller. You might remember we talked about this earlier in the course. I'm using this syntax to describe the objects and services that I need so that I can minify this file later on. Remember, minification changes the names of function arguments. So something like $interval might become just the letter N. And because Angular needs to know the names of these things to give you the proper services, minification will break your code unless you use this syntax. But when you use this syntax, you need to make sure that you're describing all the right parameters. In this case, I'm telling Angular, I need scope, I need HTTP, I need nothing else. So it's not going to pass me that interval service. To fix this problem, I would either need to add interval here into the array, or let's just get rid of the array syntax and use the simpler syntax that says, dear Angular, I want to register something called main controller. Here's the function to use. When you use that syntax, Angular will be looking at literally the names of these function arguments. So now it should see $interval, and I hope when I come back to the preview window, it's working again. Let's refresh and start from the beginning. I can see there is a countdown, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, search. So now our page is working. But there is a slight problem. It's not exactly obvious. If I refresh this page again, think about what happens if I immediately do a search, and now you'll notice the countdown still goes on. When it reaches 0, it's going to do another search. I'm going to prove to you that that is the behavior that is happening behind the scenes, and then we'll fix that up in a later clip. But before we do that, let's just take a step back and talk a little more about services now that we've gotten to meet another one.